Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Lovely to see so many people, especially after a bank holiday. I was always a little bit wary of running these after a bank holiday. I used to say I won't do them, and then people gone, "Oh, well, I'm around. Let's go." So to have 21 people in the room almost at 11:01 is brilliant. So welcome everybody. To those who don't know me, I'm recognizing most faces, but there's definitely a couple of new ones. So you're very, very welcome. My name's Matthew Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for nearly 11 years. Maybe it is 11 years. I can't remember the exact month. But I set up on my own 2.5 years ago with the idea of trying to not just recruit differently, but give back to the sector differently. My frustration when working for agencies was always that I wanted to do more for the sector itself, because it's a sector that I loved, but evidently trying to kind of convince people that this is a good return on investment when you're doing them every week is sometimes a challenge. So thank you to everyone who's been able to attend. The reason that they stay free is because so many of you use me for recruitment, and the more of you that continue to do so, the longer they can stay free. We ran 48 of these in 2022. I've lost count of how many we've done this year. At one point, I was trying to push for 50, but I don't think we're quite going to make it. But it's still wonderful to kind of have the community growing and building all the time. And I'm delighted today to welcome back Joe Leckie. Joe was one of my first guests, I think, very, very early on when we started kind of really doing co-hosting rather than me going, I'll pick a subject and let's talk about it. Turned out co-hosting got most of you more interested, which probably says more about me than the topics I was picking. But Joe and I connected via LinkedIn a fair while ago now and have worked together on some projects. I've certainly recommended Joe without question to a few of my clients, and vice versa. And she's someone who's, if you haven't come across Big Picture Training and the work they're doing in the customer service space, then please go check them out. Our other topics have often been around complaints, and I think sometimes that's where we've done a number of our previous roundtables. But today was an interesting one because we wanted to talk about internal and external customer service. And the poll that I ran, which had 168 votes on it last week, everyone seemed to say that they were equal, they're just as important as each other, and that's where the focus should be. There was only 7% who said internal and 7% said external. Everybody else said they're the same. So it'll be interesting to see where that discussion goes today. So without further ado, Joe, I'm going to pass over to you to introduce yourself, obviously Big Picture Training, and also I guess where the idea for this has come about from the work you've done with clients in the housing space. So over to you.
Okay, welcome everybody. Hi. So, as Matt has already said, I'm Joe Leckie and I am the owner and principal consultant of Big Picture Training. And we provide customer service, customer experience training and consultancy into the social housing and not-for-profit sector in both the UK and Australia. So I say that we're worldwide because we are, because Australia's a long way away. Spend perhaps 3 months of the year living and working in Australia. I've got an employee in Australia too, does quite a lot of the work for me out there. But more and more now, I'm spending a lot of time in the UK and building the portfolio that we've got in the UK. And we've been working with quite a lot of large providers in the, well, not large, medium-sized providers in the UK over the last year, 18 months, trying to make a difference in terms of the customer experience because it really needs, the sector really needs some help. And the focus for us is the social housing sector because that's where I've spent my whole career. So the last 32 years, it seems like a very long time. It makes me feel very, very old. But in operational roles, not always been in the training space, operational roles. And my last role actually was General Manager Housing for a housing organisation in Australia. So had experience not only in the UK, but also in Australia too, which is really, it's really interesting because there's the same issues over there as there are over here. Nothing different, nothing different. So today I just wanted to pose this question to you, really. What is more important, the internal or the external customer experience? I thought I'd start. I haven't really got a huge PowerPoint presentation. I've just got a couple of slides, really. So I'm just going to share my screen with you and just share a couple of slides as to kickstart the session. Right, so I'm assuming, Matt, you're going to stay in charge of the chat. I'm so used to managing Zoom on my own that when I see the chat light up, I'm like, oh.
No, all good.
But
That's exactly why I get a co-host. It helps so much.
yeah, I shall just carry on then. So you should all be able to see the first slide in my slide deck now, which is basically just some statistics. I'm just going to show you some statistics. So the UK Customer Satisfaction Index, the UK CSI, and you probably are aware of this, it's a national benchmark of customer satisfaction covering 13 sectors. And they had 52,000 responses to their most recent survey. The July 2023 results show that average customer satisfaction in the UK is at its lowest level since 2015. It's 76.6 out of 100, which is a drop of 1.8 points compared to last year even. So it's on a downward trend. And through the work that I do with organisations in Australia, I know that that is the case in Australia too. It's not just a UK thing. I think it's a post-pandemic thing. Personally, I think what's happening is, and this is what the UK CSI is saying, is that people's expectations have risen, and their ability to be able to, or their, what would you call it? I don't know. Their patience isn't so high. They're not prepared to put up with stuff that they would have put up with before. And we're finding that across the housing sector too. So HouseMark has found that overall satisfaction with housing organisations has fallen on average 6.5% compared to the same period last year. So we're struggling in housing. And we know that, because we know that even when I spoke about complaints last year, I think that complaints to the Housing Ombudsman had gone up by something like 139% this time last year. They've gone up 24% again over this time last year. So from when I was talking about complaints last year, they've gone up another 24%. You could say that's because there's more awareness of the Ombudsman, but I think it's also because we're hearing the customer voice now that we weren't hearing before. They were silent voices before. So there is a real need to sort this thing out, essentially. So we know we've got an issue. We know that the sector needs to improve the customer experience, and that customer service is key to that. Customer service is the human element of customer experience is key. On our customer service training, we ask the question, who's the customer? So we ask everyone to think about, who's your customer? And for some people, it's really hard for them to identify who their customer is. They'll say tenants, and then they can't think of anything further than that. But we end up drawing up this huge list. We conclude, as Deming did, you know, with his research, that everyone, the next person in the process, is essentially your customer. We make the distinction between the internal and the external customer. And I ask the question of them, you know, who's more important, your internal or your external customer? And I get varied answers at that point. And that's the discussion that I'd like to kickstart with all of you today. But what you're seeing on the slide now is probably something that you're all very familiar with. Do you recognize this little light on the slide? Recognize that? Yeah, the engine management light, sometimes called the check engine light. And that illuminates basically when there's something wrong with your car engine, with your exhaust, or with your emissions. You know, when that light goes on. What do you think, guys, when that light comes on? What's your thinking? Anyone?
There's a problem.
Yeah, I mean, what goes through your head? I know what goes through my head, usually shit. Isn't it? Because you're about to start a journey. You might be going quite a long way, and you think, oh my God, what's wrong with the car? Damn, am I even going to get there? I don't know. And usually what we all do is we set off and we just fingers crossed. Let's just hope everything's going to be all right. Because, you know, I haven't got time now to figure this one out. But likely this is going to cost me a lot of money. You know, what's wrong with the car? So the other day I was like, I'm going to tell you a little story now. I'll stop the share. I'm going to tell you a little story now. I was on the way to Wolverhampton Homes. I was due to deliver some toolbox talks, spend 2 days delivering toolbox talks to Wolverhampton Homes trades teams. And I'm driving up the M6, leading my best life, really. singing along to Radio 2, because I'm that age now, listen to Radio 2, leading my best life. I get to the Wolverhampton exit from the M6, and all of a sudden, my heads-up display went down. All the lights came on my dash, and my sat nav started doing an impression of the waltzers at the fair, going round and round and round and round. I'm like, do this to me now. I'm just coming off the junction. Shh. So I come off at the junction, I go up the slip lane. Luckily, I knew there was traffic lights at the top. I was thinking, please, please let those lights be at red. Let the lights be at red. Then I can stop the car and start the car again. Fingers crossed that reset the onboard computer, because that's clearly what's gone wrong here. So I get to the traffic lights. They were at red. I stop the car. My fingers crossed, please start. I'm sitting there, please start, please start. Start the car again. Everything resets back to normal. All good. All good. The thing is, and it made me think, that is like an organization, isn't it? When something goes wrong in an organization, when there's one department that's not talking properly to another department, when there's one person who's being awkward, where people are working in silos, when you can't get something done because there's a blockage in an organization, you can't just switch off the organization and switch it back on again like you can a computer or a car. It's like the song, love and marriage, go together like a horse and carriage. So do the various departments in an organization. If they're not all working together, at the end of the day, the person who suffers is the end user, people who are living in the homes. Okay. So just like when our engine warning light comes on, the people who suffer is us, the end user, the people who are using the car. That's who suffers. And it's the same in a large housing organisation. When things aren't working as they should, the people who suffer at the end of the day are the end users, the tenants. So my question to you today is, we're talking about analogies. What came first, the chicken and the egg? What is most important, the internal customer service or the external customer service? And as Matt said, the survey said, everybody says they're equally important. And what I want to say to you today is, are they though? Are they equally important? And I'm going to throw it over to you now, guys. Are they equally important? What are your thoughts? I know what my thoughts are. What are your thoughts?
Would anybody like to start, or shall I start questioning Joe straight off the bat? Jan, over to you. Was that your hand going up? Yes, please, go on.
It's internal. So first of all, can you hear me? It's the first check. Are
Yeah.
we okay? Okay. It's internal, because if you haven't got your internal, and I hate the term customer, if you haven't got your internal colleagues working with you, then nothing actually works, because you can't do anything actually on your own. You can lead from the front, but from a front-facing service, unless you've got everybody working with you behind you or next to you, then it doesn't work. So in my experience, Joe, I've been around 55 years, not 30.
I know. No,
in my experience, unless you've got your colleagues with you around you, then nothing works. And if everything is working internally, then there is an automatic follow-on that everything will work externally as well. That's my opinion.
Yeah, and I know from your experience, evidently, like you say, working with a number of providers, that, as you've mentioned, they've been in the sector a little bit of time. Have you seen those internal teams get stronger, or do you think weaker on average over the last maybe few years in particular? Because it seems to me that that's one of the big issues, is that there's so much focus on the external, we're not doing enough to focus on the internal.
The challenge, I stopped being an interim manager in 2019 for various reasons. And it seems to me one of the challenges for public sector organisations is there has now been such a proliferation of interim managers and temporary managers coming into an organisation that quite often the organisation itself doesn't sort that out before it goes anywhere else. So you've got people coming in doing their best on their own, but proving my point that on their own they can't do anything at all. Sorry, they can't be as effective as they ought to be. So the challenge in recent years has been with the proliferation of temps, whether they be low-grade temps or high-grade temps or very highly paid temps, without knowing the landscape into which they're being thrown, and that sometimes depends on the on the recruitment agency or the agency they're working for. Unless the landscape is clear, it's as bad as putting, if you use the farming analogy, a sheep into a field where there's a raging bull. Unless you've got the landscape right, it's going to fail.
Completely fair. Joe, thoughts on that before I bring Dave in? You're on mute.
Put myself on mute so to eliminate any background noise, and then forgot. Okay, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That is one of the issues that we're putting. There are a lot of temps going into organisations at the moment, interims, because a lot of organisations are going through huge restructures, aren't they? They're restructuring to try and get the customer experience better, but actually what's happening is you're then getting an interim team. And you're right, having been an interim and going in there, you can be going in there with the best possible intentions, but ultimately, if you're met with blockages, you're not going to be successful. You can't be successful. Certainly, I agree with that to some degree. Yeah.
Dave, I'm going to bring you in. What I would say on both on both Jan and Joe's point there is that definitely there's restructures and everything going on. There's also an incredible amount of burnout. And a lot of people going off sick and a lot of people kind of walking away, suddenly going, I can't. So people are coming to, I've got a compliance manager vacancy I'm working on down in Surrey at the moment. The issue now is that because so many people burned out and left the sector, we now don't have an interim market to tap into. So they need quick support whilst their person's off for whatever reason they're off. We need to get someone in, but so many brilliant people, and a bit like Joe and Dave and Jan and other people I know in this room went off and set up their own consultancies and now aren't available to go in and step into those roles. So it's a real balance. And I think it's that interim market, which is where I started on when I was doing housing recruitment, has shifted massively, particularly post-COVID. Dave, I'm going to bring you in. Dave, you in? You're not on mute.
You're not on mute. Yeah, he was working.
Can you hear us? Yeah, try speaking, see if we can hear you. No, he's gone. Okay, we'll come back to Dave shortly. Elliot said there, I think the quality of your external customer service is dependent on the quality of your internal customer service. I'm assuming this is something you're seeing quite regularly as well, Joe, because I know you do a lot of work with customer service teams.
Yeah. Ultimately, if you were to ask me my opinion, I would say that the internal customer experience is more important than your external customer. It's more important to focus on your internal, because if you get that right, the external customer experience naturally follows. And I go into organisations in Australia and the UK to provide customer service training to teams, and ultimately, sometimes, particularly the front-facing teams, they've been told they've got to come on customer service training. So there's resistance anyway, because it's mandatory training. They've not said that they want to come on it. They're not elected to come on this training, but it's mandatory training for them. So there's resistance anyway. And you can see the fatigue. You can, as you mentioned, Matt, you can see the fatigue from front-facing staff. They want to do their best, but they then will start telling you all the things that stop them from doing their best and their internal blockages. And so whenever I go into an organisation, I will always provide feedback, that qualitative feedback, the feedback that I've had, because I'm going in impartial. I'm completely impartial. People tell me stuff that they might not be prepared to talk about internally, because usually in organizations like that, there's a fear of speaking up. People will tell me stuff, and then I will always provide a feedback report to that organization. But I'm seeing empathy fatigue. I'm seeing a lack of resilience, particularly in front-facing teams. They're just, as you said, Matt, they've just had enough, because they're being asked to do more and more with less and less. And now I'm coming in and knocking them over the head and telling them they've got to do things and I don't believe anyone goes to work to do a bad job, actually. I think most people go to work to do a good job, but people are prevented from doing that for one reason or another.
Dave, I'm going to try and bring you in again, because I know you haven't got long left, and then I'm going to go to Richard. Dave, can you hear us okay now?
I can. Sorry about that, Matt. Can you hear me okay? Yeah.
We can. Welcome.
It was going back to that other question, following on what Jan said, and I approach things slightly differently, where what we don't do is put any focus on one particular internal or external, but say they're both equally as important as each other, in the sense that everyone's on a different journey of where they are in their organization. So it might well be one day one's more important than the other. But the reason we look at interdependence in the processes and everything we do is to make sure that the whole thing works together. It's a synergy, in the sense that, without good, as Jan said, internal customer attention, you will not get good retention of the customer experience being good, i.e. the tenant. But it also goes the other way. I'll give you one brief example on that, Matt. I was at a board meeting last night as a board member, and the organisation I'm a board member for, their complaints is low, their customer service is fantastic. And I asked, what is the secret? And the secret is we pay attention to our customers, but we internally work as a team. And I think it's a small organisation. I think that's the really important thing here, that you don't just try and say good cop, bad cop all the time. I think that's my point, Matt. So if anyone's, Joel's got any, I know Joel well, so I'm sure she's got her views on that as well.
Oh, really? I agree with you, my Dave. I agree with you. And I think often this gets lost with scale as well.
Yeah.
Because if you think about my organization, I've got 2 employees and the rest of the people who work for me are associates. And ultimately, we have to provide customer service excellence every time. Because if we don't do it right every time, the reputation gets out there, we won't get more work, we won't have jobs anymore, ultimately. So on the small scale, we have to do it right every time. As an organization gets bigger and bigger and bigger, there's less focus on your jobs depend on this.
Yeah.
And less focus on that whole, and more blame about it's their fault. It's that, it's not my team, it's their team. It's if that team was better than, and then you become, and I know that I've done this myself over the years. Let's get the competition going. We want to be better than that team. And ultimately, when you do that, what you're doing is you're silo working. You're not thinking big picture. And so I think the organisation you're talking about, Dave, is a very small organisation. It's still got that. And I've worked for really small organisations like that. I remember I worked for Rockingham Forest before they became part of Grand Union. And it was lovely to feel really responsible for the success of the organisation.
Scale is important.
The bigger you get, the harder it becomes to keep that feeling, that sense.
I think there's one phrase that always rings true here: treat others the way you'd like to be treated, no matter the size and the scale. And all of these things. So I think it's important that we look at both facets.
I think
I agree with that, Dave.
As well as making sure, though, that the managers are trained in the right way, that they know how to train staff, because that is a big issue. We don't often train managers. I'm going to bring Richard in. I know you've been patient, so Richard, I'm going to bring you in, then I'm going to come back to it, Joe. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, I think there's numerous issues here. It's one of them being culture. I think organisations have to get the culture right. Some of the people in this room might be members of organisations that have merged. Culture can then always be a little bit blurred. What's important to the business? Obviously, I think you've talked about it before. A lot of our colleagues are feeling it at the moment. They are feeling what our customers are feeling. And I think, and I'm gonna swear now, so I do apologise to anybody, but I was sat in a meeting with our director for repairs and maintenance. Obviously, he's got damp and mold coming out of his ears, and we're a relatively small organisation with decent stock. So, but he said I think the team are feeling really fed up of working this hard to be this shit. And I think that's how a lot of people are feeling at the moment. I went to, there's probably people in this room, I went to the Housing 23, and I felt like we were all getting a bollocking. I felt like we were all getting told off that housing needs to do more, that there was a lot of customers there, as there should be, calling us to account. But I think people walked away from a lot of the groups and a lot of the breakouts feeling, well, I can't work any harder. I can't do any more. And we're still being told that we're not doing enough. And we're still being told by customers are standing up there saying, why can't you resolve these complaints? Why can't you get it done? Because it's not that easy. you know, because we don't have some property set aside. So if you've got damp or mold, you can move into it while we get the works done. We're going to have to work around you. We can't move you because you're overcrowded. You're going to have to go to the local authority. The local authority are going to push back to say you need to go to your landlord because that's their default position. So, and then it's the people on the phones and the people who are going through the doors that are thinking, well, I can only be so nice for so long, and I'm giving everything I possibly can give. And then from an internal customer perspective, money talks, and a lot of organizations aren't awash with a lot of money at the moment. And we can all sit around as heads of service around the table going, yeah, I want to work with, we want to work together. It's all about the customer. But when then our directors come to us and say, well, you need to cut your costs, or we need to get more for less, then we're going to start looking internally. And when I go to a heads of assets, or when I go to head of repairs, they're going to look after themselves first. I can guarantee that. You know, they're not going to come because the finance people are onto them. So I think we're in this cauldron of, you know, really tricky operational and strategic challenges at the moment. And I think we've got to see through it. I think the interim market is something we're having to look outside of housing at the moment to recruit, because you're right, there isn't the market, but housing is quite unique. You know, you can get people certainly from like surveyors coming in from the commercial side. You know, our customers aren't commercial customers. You know, they're very, you know, you have to, there's a way about social housing, and you have to love social housing. You can't just come into it as vocation. You know, you come into it because you want to be in it. You know, a lot of people drop in it, but then they stay in it. And I think there's a lot of issues, and, you know, but, you know, we're resilient. We are resilient. I know what Joe's saying. There is a lack of resilience, and I think that's post-COVID. I think we're coming out of a pandemic. We're coming out of a cost of living crisis. It's like, what's the next thing that's going to hit us? You know, but I think we'll get through it. I do think we'll get through it, and I do think it will settle down with the ombudsman. I think there'll be a general election, and priorities inevitably will change. You know, but hopefully we will learn from these last 12, 18 months, but try and stay positive. And I think for us as leaders, it's hard to get that buy-in from the staff, you know, at the moment, because they're all working remotely or working hybrid. They come into the office. There's no real sense of team here, you know, because you can miss people. So we need to drive that culture ourselves, and hopefully get that feeling back of people really wanting to be out there, people wanting to be challenged, rather than thinking, oh my God, not another complaint. Sorry, I'll shut up now. I went on.
It's all good. Joe, please respond.
Well, obviously, I know Richard, because I've spent quite a lot of time working in your organisation over the last few months, haven't I, Richard?
You have.
Absolutely get the sense of what you're feeling too at the moment. Absolutely. And I have to say, the organisation that you work for, you're a wonderful organisation doing some wonderful stuff out there. And as you say, I have sensed the feeling that, you know, we've just had enough. There's just, you can see, you look around the room and you think, like, you can't. And you said you came out of the conference feeling that you've been hit over the head. I feel like that, and I didn't even go to conference. This year I didn't go because I just had a new grandchild. But I felt like that reading about conference, and I just wanted to say, let's just remember what we're here for. Let's go back to our why, because ultimately, as you said, Richard, we're all in this because we want to make a difference. It becomes a vocation rather than just a job. And we all need to remember that, actually, why we're doing this, and go back to our why, and dig deep. But I think we need to give the staff some help with that. They need some help to build their resilience back up again. And I did a blog post about this, a LinkedIn post about this a couple of weeks ago, really. As an interim, talking about interims, I did an interim job with a team of financial counsellors for 6 months in Australia. And at the end of the day, they all have professional supervision. So we're talking about the sector becoming more professional, professionalisation, housing officers all having a qualification, with that professionalization, there needs to come some professional support so that people can, when they're having a bad day, and as I've been a housing officer for a long time, you have bad days and you need someone to be able to talk to about that, coach you and mentor you through that. And I think that's what's lacking at the moment. If you
There's
want to
also a big issue
professionalize the
there, right,
sector,
isn't
you
there,
need.
around that kind of budget. You know, if we're talking about professionalization, we're talking about bringing people in, there's an issue with budgets. Even though there is money in the sector, let's not pretend otherwise, because there are some people who are very senior on the sector on huge salaries,
and it's being spent in the wrong places. That's what I think.
and that's, you know, and I've put up posts regarding that before about whether there should be a cap on chief exec and executive roles, and that was a really interesting debate. So there is money, but it's a difficult one because, as Richard said, you have to attract talent from the outside the sector. They sometimes have bigger salaries, but then, you know, it's the balance between the two. And I really like that point Richard made as well, and I'm sure we'll all agree with this, that when we're younger, we've worked in jobs where you stay in the job because your mates are there, or because you see the same people every day, or because you feel part of a family, or whatever you try and kid yourself with, but you stay in it because it's enough. And now what's happened is that actually people aren't in the office quite so often, they aren't staying in the business quite so often, and so it's far easier to go, oh, I've got an hour here, I'll go and look. And I've said this before on the roundtable, the most popular time for job hunting in the UK at the moment is Monday morning between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. After that Monday,
is that true?
It's the most amount of applications in the UK are made between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. on a Monday morning, because you go in after the weekend, you think, all right, I'll be fine. Something happens in that Monday morning meeting, or you see your boss again, or whatever, it'll be like, I'm done, I'm out, and you apply for a role. And it's the busiest time in the UK. Adam, you've been incredibly patient. I'm going to bring you in. Thank you so much.
That's all right. Thank you. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. Good to be here. This is my first one. These are just points, really. I'm just reflecting on myself a lot in my day-to-day, because that pretty much everyone's raised. But some of these points are also, for organisations right now, are very lean. That's not likely to go away anytime soon. So what do we do with that leanness, and how do we create and be the best we can within that environment? I'm quite a process-driven person. Transformation is my thing. So our process is fit for purpose, and are they designed with the user, you know, whether that be internal or external customer, you know, at the heart of everything we do? Because sometimes our knee-jerk reactions are not conducive to the environments that we work in, and therefore everything process-wise is not fit for purpose. Thirdly, are we reacting positively to the external world, the world that we're in right now? So the nuances and the change that is afoot, that we are living and breathing, are we really reacting to them in the best possible way? Fourth, empowerment for me. I think the ability to empower our colleagues in such a way, and giving them the tools that they need, even in spite of challenging circumstances. If you've got that empowerment and it's trickling down from exec, then you've really got a good workforce that is resilient and willing to react to any changes that are afoot. Obviously going hand in hand with processes and that level of support as well. And point 5 for me is, I don't think you can ever over communicate. I'm learning this at the moment. I've just gone through a major transformation, and you just cannot over communicate ever. People love it, even if sometimes it's a bit dull. You can keep doing it, and it sinks in, and people feel part of that kind of that alliance. You know what I mean? You know, in these challenging and tricky times. And kind of very lastly and flippantly, we work in a very heavily regulated environment. So I think we should never lose that focus and the cause of why we're around and what we do in social housing care and beyond. You know, this is not Goldman Sachs. You are not going to get a 200k bonus. So if that's where your head's at, you're in the wrong game. You know, and I'm a firm believer of that. And that's got to come from exec as well.
I completely agree. And I liked what you said about lean businesses. I think let's not get away from the fact that, I mean, certainly I see it from my side, and I do recruitment. I'd love to say 5 days a week. It certainly isn't 5. It feels like 20. That recruitment's never been more difficult, and everyone has vacancies, and everyone is trying to recruit from the same pool. So businesses are lean. Funding isn't there. Registered providers have had to become developers alongside, because there's no development from central government. That there's so many challenges there, and I couldn't agree with you. That process is fit for purpose. Again, that's I like, you know, when I think about that, it's not just process as well, it's systems, it's everything. And
It's people, process, technology always, but it's with the user at heart. So if you're not going out to change a process that you are getting all of your good information from your customers, from your colleagues, then you should not be doing it. You know, it's really, really important. I do a lot of stuff with customers, and you make amazing inroads because you've listened and you've changed your landscape in accordance with what the need is.
Completely agree. Joe, I can see you nodding away. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself, actually, Adam. I was just thinking, I couldn't have put that better myself, actually. Everything that you've just said, ultimately, what I find is that the organisations that are the most successful are those where there is good leadership. So it starts right from the top. Actually, starts with the board and with the chief exec. And when you've got they're on board, then it trickles down. But you've got to have that really good leadership. That's where it starts. As I said, I've just worked with Richard's organisation. His chief exec, I was there delivering maybe, I don't know how many sessions I've delivered over the last 3 months. I saw him on a regular basis. He came in and he had a chat because he was really interested in what was being said, what I was discovering, how the sessions were going. He cared. He wants to make a difference. And that's where it starts. The organizations where big picture training struggles to make a difference is those organizations where the exec don't engage because they don't think they need to, because they think that they're above that. That's where we really struggle to make a difference. So yes, it starts with the exec. We say on our training, you can't communicate enough. Communicate, whether that's with your external customer or internal. How many organizations actually have an internal communication strategy around this kind of stuff? Because that's your external communication strategy is important. So is your internal communication strategy. Communicate, even when there's nothing to communicate. People like to know what's going on. You know, the number of organizations where people say to me, we don't know about tenant satisfaction measures. Nobody's told us about that. We don't, you know, I'm the first person. This is all news to them when I start talking about that kind of stuff. It shouldn't be news. It shouldn't be coming from me. That should already have been rolled out across the organization. People should be aware of that.
There's also then, and I can see Adam's put in the chat there that everyone has to get their hands dirty from time to time. And as Richard and Adam both said, you know, when you're looking at your customer basis and people are going, well, okay, well, we can't do that right now. Well, your staff need to know why you can't do it. If you can't, that's okay if there's a decision, but help them understand why, and not just from we don't have the budget. Well, that's fine, but where this is important. So where's that budget being spent elsewhere, and is that as important? It's those kind of real understandings when you have like a unified team moving forward. What you also find, as you've mentioned before, and it's come through from a couple of people, is better communication than between teams naturally without it being forced, because they'll naturally want to help each other. Jan, please. Yes.
And the other point, of course, is if people don't speak and a vacuum is created, stuff is made up because you can't. No organisation exists in a vacuum. So unless something is being said, and the point that's a really good point, Matt, about the money. People at every level of the organisation needs to understand should understand how the organisation is managed, and that management bit exists along the money stuff and the plan stuff and the strategy stuff and all the stuff that is really, really boring, but actually, if it's done properly, means that everybody from the person who's cleaning the stairs in a tower block to the chief exec actually knows what the bloody hell we're doing and why we're doing it. And it's the why we're doing it bit is the important bit, and the getting your hands dirty bit. I couldn't agree more. At one point, some years ago, I was the only chief officer in London, because I retired from a London borough in 1999. That's how long I've been retired. I was at one point a chief officer in one London borough and an elected residents rep in another London borough. But at one point, I would regularly go out on a Saturday morning to visit resident caretakers have to say, initially they weren't that keen on their governor turning up at 8 o'clock in the morning to see whether they're actually out pushing the broom. But people got used to it and got the idea that perhaps I was interested in what was happening. And as a result of that, people then spoke to me. That whole point about people only talking to the trainer rather than talking to their colleagues and their managers is just scary.
It's
Because
scary.
if that culture, and I hate the culture stuff, but if that culture existed in an organisation, how the hell can you work properly if you're scared of talking to somebody about what's going wrong in the organisation? We're back to in the old days. We had things called staff suggestion schemes. There was a box where you'd stick a piece of paper in and make a suggestion. You might get a 50 quid. It was years before Amazon. It was a Marks and Spencer or a W.H. Smith voucher, but you could make suggestions. And that sort of stuff needs to be, I hate to say started again, but it needs to be brought back.
Close the circle so that people feel that they are actually valued.
Yes.
Where I've been working recently, I noticed the chief exec was out in the kitchen making a cuppa, and one of the landscape guys was out there as well. And he asked him how things were going. And the next time I looked, they were sitting in the office together, and they were in there for an hour having a chat. The chief exec wanted to know how it was going from the landscape guy's point of view, and was sat there listening to him. And I thought, I noticed he knows everyone by name. And I thought there's some organisations that I've worked in that size where the chief exec wouldn't be able to tell you even who his heads of service were, let alone who the landscape guy who cuts the hedges is. Do you know what I mean? So
yes, and
that's the sort of culture that you need in an organisation
and
for
that
it to be successful.
and that hasn't been helped following the pandemic, because
No.
I think it was Richard who mentioned teams. The fact that some teams aren't actually physically in the same room bouncing ideas of each other, it's bounced off a flat bloody screen, which is a bit difficult to bounce anything off a screen. That whole thing has to be managed sympathetically, I think, because obviously people need to be with each other in order to. We're back to there's no I in team, aren't we? That all that nonsense about that stuff. But a team needs to work properly, and it won't work if everybody is remote all of the time.
Also interesting on your point there, Jan, and we'll all have seen it when people have hired someone who seems brilliant, but when they come in, they've brought those fears and issues from their previous business with them. So of course, if they've got an issue, they don't speak up about it. So then suddenly they're underperforming because they won't speak. So yeah, but I can't tell my boss, because in their old place they couldn't tell their boss. And so that's a cultural thing that needs fixing. And round we go. There's a point there from the chat from Yasmin. Absolutely agree. Customer service delivery has come down to budgets versus resources, and the sector is under really heavy scrutiny. And obviously we're very aware, I think, of the scrutiny at the moment. I think part of the issue is that scrutiny isn't going to go away. If anything, it's going to double down even more. It seems to have become one of the main focuses of the election as and when that'll happen in the next year, 18 months. So I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more about social housing. There was a piece, I think, that came up on the news the other day. If you went back 2 years ago, no one outside of the sector knew what social housing was. And now suddenly everyone's an expert because they've heard about all the stuff in the news and how social housing providers are failing. There needs to definitely be that camaraderie of coming together. I'm aware going into the last 15 minutes, I always want to make sure on these roundtables that we have some feasible action ideas, because as we've said today, it's very clear that there's the balance between the two, and you can have some amazing external customer service policies, processes, tech, whatever you want, but if your internal teams aren't on the same page or aren't unified within the business, it's never going to be used. So going to you, Joe, and then also to anyone who would love to hear from, how do you feel you need to start that process, other than bringing yourselves in? Because obviously that's how I've pitched it before.
I think,
but other than that, how do people get started? How do you realise maybe that your internal systems aren't working? Because I think a lot of time when you go into a business, or I've gone into a business, you know it straight away. When I've walked into Bromsgrove District Housing or Spring, just some other clients that I've worked with recently, I've gone in, big smiles from reception, big welcomes, hello from everyone. You walk in, you feel welcome within minutes. And you've gone other places, and then you can feel a culture, the hostility almost. So where do people start? Because it can be a huge issue. As we've already mentioned, let's not get away from the fact that more people are being asked to do more and more for no real extra money. That's going to be a challenge. this isn't an easy fix, but where can people start? Because as Esther's just put in the chat, if you're looking to be more psychologically informed, 3 of the 5 sections relate to teams and colleagues. So managers need to adjust their focus, if needed, to their team's well-being.
Esther, absolutely. That was what I was going to say, is people need to have a jolly good, long, hard look at themselves. The management team, the exec team, the senior management team need to be honest about what's going on in their organization. Because at the moment, I think, and it goes back to what Adam was saying about positivity, in some organizations, there isn't that positivity. It's a lot of blame between departments, between teams, but there needs to be some positivity around, okay, what could we do differently? And the onus has got to be on the leadership, hasn't it? Okay, as leaders, we're going to sort this out, guys, because it's not working. So what are we going to do differently? And we've got to be accountable. We've got to hold each other accountable for that. And we've got to be positive about this. And the key messages that we agree on in this room, they've got to be cascaded down through the organisation. Otherwise, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to work. But what tends to happen is they'll agree on one thing in exec or senior management team, and they'll come out, and then those messages will be diluted. They'll be communicated in a different way down through the organisation, depending on the manager. There'll be some defensiveness, there'll be some blame, and actually people need to stop doing that. But it's about culture change, isn't it? It's about real accountability.
Around the blame culture especially is a real challenge. Let's not get away from there, because as has been mentioned, the pressure teams are under is huge. And sometimes you've got to go, I just can't deal with this right now, right? It's someone else's fault. Even if you know it isn't, people do pass the buck. And what you find often is it's people on the front line who, right at the entry level of the organisation, who get it's that chain of screaming that used to be a thing, and they're the ones getting in the neck and going, well, what more do you want from me? And I know we've got Yasmin in the room, who I've talked to extensively about this before. They're the people that need to be in those decision-making rooms, because they'll be the ones that actually see how it's impacting your customer day to day the most.
Should always be asking, what about the customer? What about the customer? Because ultimately, organisations often design processes around what's best for the organisation rather than what's best for the customer. So we should always be asking, what about the customer, in every conversation that we have? And I don't think we do.
Liz has put in the chat there, it's a culture of wanting to listen to others and addressing that blame culture. And it's hard. It is hard. I think what's also interesting, though, is there are people who I know who are desperate to try and work in this sector, who haven't got experience yet, that can add a lot more. I think sometimes there needs to be a piece around, we talk about professionalization. I think we also need to talk a little bit around almost a bit of an ego sometimes within housing, with people who kind of go, oh, well, you don't understand housing, so you just don't get it. Well, actually, housing is
a fundamental thing.
It's not simple, but it's not so complicated you can't learn it, because most people learned it at an entry level and then have learned and build their skills up and through. And it's that apathy, and it's that actually wanting to do things for customers, and it's that piece around a real kind of focus on who your customers are and why you're wanting to support them. And as Richard's just put there in the chat, we need more colleagues with lived experience. Let's do something to try and change that narrative. I'm going to come back to you in a moment, Joe, because we've got both Alison and Yasmin with their hands raised. Over to you, Alison, first.
Hi, thanks. It's a really interesting subject. Particularly, I work in governance, so I'm sort of mainly involved in internal customer, and it's always interesting to think what would help frontline colleagues more in terms of how we work with them. But I'm thinking back to Claire's talk a few weeks ago about knowledge and information management, and the spotlight on that, particularly from the Ombudsman. I don't think we can divorce any of this from the issues around multiple IT systems and single views of the customer. And I think that's as big a problem for the frontline staff trying to give a clear answer to a customer who's in front of them as it is to all the internal work that we do. I'm thinking particularly, I used to be responsible for complaints in my previous role, and all that tracking of who said what to who and how difficult that is, and as well as being an internal issue, that translates when you're talking externally to the customer. If you can't find anything, or the kind of flow of what's happened to that resident isn't clear. So I've got an answer to that, but I really think that we're at a bit of a crossroads, I feel, in the sector with IT. We've had these systems for years of kind of, there's a lot to be said for having a single housing management system, but then there's a lot of people developing bespoke things. And I think with all the other digital stuff that's going on, people being able to self-report, I think we need to be very careful about how that works in the wider customer context.
Agreed. I completely agree. And I think it's you look at some of the big issues that we've had this year in the sector, and so often it's because there's multiple systems that aren't talking to each other properly. That drives your frontline staff mad. They then tell their managers that the reason I can't do it is because the systems don't work. And the response often is, that's the systems you've got, you're going to have to find a way. They get more frustrated. Managers realize that the staff can't perform the system, so they report it up the line, but nothing gets changed. And that culture then becomes just one of, we're being set up to fail. And I know Dave, who was here before, specializes in this, but it's exactly that. And I couldn't agree more with you, Alison. So thank you for raising it today. Yasmin, do come in. It's nice to see you. If you can hear me. Might not be there. Difficult when there's not a screen.
Oh, why do we all
Yasmin.
do this? Why? How long have we been doing these on Zoom and Teams, and we're still on mute? Wow. I'll start again. I absolutely loved what Joe said. Very, very close to my heart, Joe. They will devise processes, and they will put procedures and policies in place. And I just think that I don't know how everyone else feels or everybody agrees about this. I've been an interim for the last 3 years, and with the exception of one organisation, I have noticed the dwindling existence of resident boards and resident involvement in wanting to shape processes. Our end user is our residents. We're not in the business of selling anything, or we're not in the business of making and manufacturing. We are in the business of people. So I'm very, very curious to ask heads and those above, what are we doing to increase our resident involvement? We're over COVID now. I mean, I know during COVID it was a bit difficult kind of involving people, but I remember when I was with Housing for Women, we still did a remote resident meeting. So I just think that resident involvement was dwindling before COVID, and then during COVID, I just think in some places it's become non-existent.
Couldn't agree more. Joe, thoughts on that?
I think it's about, how do you hear the resident voice? Does it need to be classic resident involvement, or can we hear what people want in different ways? And I noticed Paul has made comments about we need to be getting out there and be more visible, and we do, because we're all hiding behind our Zoom chat windows and our team chat windows, and working from home. And good housing management is about being highly visible, out on patch, people knowing who you are, what you look like. That's what, in my opinion, good housing management is all about. And housing organisations are increasingly thinking about how they can do that now. I know even Places for People, huge organisation, are thinking about how they can make their housing officers more visible. So we've gone full circle almost from when I started, and that's what happens in housing. We keep going full circle, but that works. And if if there are people here who were housing officers when I was back in the 90s, that if you want to be able to manage your patch well, you need to be highly visible. How you make yourself highly visible has changed over time, but you do need to personalize the service. That's, if you personalize the service for someone, so we're talking about someone's home. It's a highly personal thing. Certainly, I think that will help.
Well, we had Tom Norris on last week. To anyone who missed it, it is up on the YouTube channel. Please go and check it out. Tom Norris from Places for People came on and talked actually exactly about this. And they went, well, what we did is we reassessed senior management, directors, executives, looked at actually who was having an impact, how many people were having an impact on the customer itself. And they made some redundancies, and then they hired more frontline staff. And by doing that, patch sizes have shrunk, interaction with customers has improved, staff well-being has improved. People feel like they've got more control over their patch again, so they want to stay, so they want to be part of the business. Yes, okay, pay rises have come with it. All of these things have come through because they went, what is everyone's impact on the customer? And if we've got too many people that don't have an impact, then we've got to make some changes. Just in terms of the chats, there's a few points come up. As you mentioned there, Joe, Paula Locke, the main issue to improve customer satisfaction is repairs. The industry lacks skills in this area, which then takes a toll on housing management teams who are also feeling burned out. If you look at what's changed since 2015, a lot needs to be said for mergers and the size of organizations and size of patches people manage. Getting out in the community and knowing your customer has been lost. Everyone is feeling the pinch, and when people's finances are stretched, they become less happy and express this by complaining. Sometimes it's about asking the why. Sometimes the complaints are generated by other life events, and the landlord is their one staple in life. We need to get back out in the communities, consistent staff working in those communities, manage repairs and be realistic what can be achieved with the money available. Be honest and communicate this to customers and ask what's the priority for them. And I think that piece at the end there about communicating with your customers and making people realize that if there are a lot of tiny little things that aren't really impacting day to day, it is going to come down the list so that we can prioritize this elsewhere is essential. And then Patricia Harrington, I've seen many housing providers use good satisfaction scores to not make improvements, but we can't use this as the only torch to light our way. If we want to move from tactical talking into a more strategic way of thinking, we need to face into where we can make a real difference for our customers. Can we hear what customers are saying outside of traditional government routes? We need a spotlight to get into all the nooks. Ellie Darling, I find it encouraging from a tenant voice perspective that the RSH consultation on customer regs changes the tenant involvement and empowerment standard to be called transparency, influence and accountability standard. Absolutely key. And Jan, information can be cascaded up as well as down. If teams identify an issue, good or bad, and pass the information up to the manager, this is one way to create new ways of communicating. And I would just add to that, it also massively empowers your teams to know that they can do that in the first place. Joe, we're into the last 90 seconds. I'm going to kind of pass you to wrap up thoughts on today, but also what you would kind of just urge people to start doing immediately, because sometimes being self-reflective isn't easy in and of itself.
I would urge people, one of the biggest things I would urge people to do is think about those relationships that you have within your organization. Those people that you struggle to get on with are the people you need to get on with the most. The people where you have those difficult relationships with internally, those internal relationships that are the difficult ones are the ones you need to work on. Because actually where you've got good relationships, that's great. But what about those difficult ones? Because they're the ones that are creating blockages across the organizations, causing silo working. That's what you really need to think about, your unconscious bias and how that is impacting on your relationships internally. Because that is possibly what is stopping your organization from being as successful as it could be. And when Jan says about listening to people feeding up, yes, listen to the people telling you, because they are your customers, your internal customers telling you what needs to change. Listen to those people and then feed back to them and tell them what you've done as a result of their feedback, because let them feel that they've actually been heard. That listening piece is so important. Listening and being heard. That is really important.
Like I say, it's listening and then reacting to it.
And telling people what you've done.
Oh, 100%. Joe, what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm all over LinkedIn, all over the place. My website, www.bigpicturetraining.com. Please get in touch if you want any training or consultancy in this area of the business.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us today. I've really, really appreciated it. A couple of final points from me. Firstly, Ben Hunt, who's in the room today, is going to be joining me next week. We're going to be talking about whether it's actually possible to have a victim-led approach to ASB. So it'll be a really, really interesting chat. Looking forward to that one. And also just I haven't really done this before, but Grace Burgess is with us in the room today. To anyone who came to the live roundtable in Manchester as well, she joined us there. She's got loads of experience in community work, in managing teams and other stuff, but is struggling to get into the area because, again, doesn't have the word social housing on her CV in the traditional form. If you're looking for someone who genuinely has got a true passion for this sector and the ethics with it, please reach out to Grace. I'm not taking a plug. I'm not taking any commission or anything like that. I just want to help Grace get into work into the sector. So please do reach out. On that, Joe, a massive thank you to you for today. Looking forward to catching up with you, no doubt, soon. And if anybody wants to isn't on the mailing list or anything like that for next week, please let me know. I'll get you everything sent over. But for now, thanks everybody, and thank you for joining today.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye.
Thanks, Joe.